Tahoe, California, the reading capital of the world. We're on a mission to make reading fun and achievable for all. If you enjoy the conversation, please hit subscribe below. Every vote of support counts. You can also follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn at 99 Pages Club. Today, we are making time to speak with Erik Edstrom, the author of Un-American, A Soldier's Reckoning, of America's longest war. He and I actually served in the exact same, not just the same country in Afghanistan, not just the same province, but actually the same villages. He was just there a year before I was. So when I read this book, it spoke to me. And I wanted to bring him on. He was so kind to accept this invitation because, you know, this entire month we've been talking about veterans. We read Tribe by Sebastian Junger to get into an honest conversation about war, its effects on our psychology, and how we can better prepare America and veterans in the future. So, Erik, your book has just set me on this course of events in many ways, of exploring like public safety, military policy. And, you know, I'd love to just give you the floor real quick to introduce yourself, give us a little bit about your background and really why you wrote this book. Would you mind sharing?
Yeah, sure thing. Well, thank you very much for having me on your show. I'm extremely grateful to be here. So thank you very much, Rajiv.
Absolutely, man. And so where are you from? How'd you end up joining the military? Yeah, let's hear the backstory.
Yeah, so I grew up outside of Boston, in a small town about 40 minutes outside, just south of the city, called Stoughton, Massachusetts. I witnessed September 11th from the sort of chemistry class, high school, classroom. And around that time when you're sort of thinking about what it is you want to do with your life, at that point in time, being sort of young, full of piss and vinegar, the idea is, maybe I join the military. So, like you, and maybe we hear more about some of the reasons you went to West Point as well. I put in my application, was thankful to get a nomination from then Senator John Kerry, and attended West Point. And I graduated in '07. And, during that period of time, gravitated more and more towards sort of that hard charging infantry lifestyle where, when you're at the academy, there's a tremendous amount of magnetism for like doing combat arms stuff, not being a paper pusher is sort of the idea of, like your proximity to dying for the flag is how patriotic you are in a way. And from that point, I branched infantry. I, did some of the standard lieutenant stuff, went to Fort Benning, did Ranger School and Airborne School and Reconnaissance School, took command of a platoon of about 30 guys out in Colorado and deployed to Afghanistan in 2009 and 2010, which was sort of like the nexus for thinking about all of this stuff and spending a lot of time writing in mud shacks. I don't know. Did you have a journal, Rajiv, when you were out in Afghanistan in combat?
I did actually, and I think you and I talked about when I got back. I started actually sending those articles to the New York Times and Time, and started publishing a little bit more robustly. It's, I mean, you and I served in this exact same AO, area of operations. I mean, like when I think back on my time there, I see poverty. I see chaos. I see this, it felt like stepping back into this different world, maybe 500, 600, even 700 years ago. I mean, when, help us get into your headspace. When you were there, you were even there before I was. Like, what do you recall and make of Kandahar, of Zari, Panjwai, the Arghandab River Valley, 10 years later?
Yeah, I mean, painting the picture when you're there, you're filled with, on one hand, quite a bit of excitement because this is sort of what we had spent so many years thinking about and trying to mentally prepare for. And you read books, you do these canned military training exercises, and what you realize on the ground is it's very different. And there's nothing that you can do in your training, or at least nothing that I experienced in the training, that sort of prepares you for that moment when, I hit the ground and within 4 days, 4 of my guys were injured in a vehicle ID. So they were, hit a victim operated IED, And I was calling in air medevacs day 4. Shooting guys up with ketamine. The medic was, and getting them evacuated. So it was a very rude awakening very early on in the deployment. And I recall being the sort of first platoon in the battalion to get the CIBs pinned onto everybody's chest. And you're like, this is going to be a long tour, is sort of what's going through my mind. And if you're going at that rate, right, like in the first week, if you have 4 guys out of your 30 injured, you realize you're going to be decimated very quickly, and that weighs on your mind quite a bit. But I mean, around the surrounding areas, you're struck by the abject poverty, as I'm sure you're aware of. Like outside of the cities, no electricity. You know, poverty is high. Schools are limited or closed altogether. Medical attention and capacity is certainly not very much.
Well said, man. And I think I had similar experiences as yourself. And, I got to admit, the premise of the book, right? And let me start off with my reaction, is that it drew out a very emotional response for me, right? Because I feel like you and I saw the same kind of, this abject poverty, this lifestyle from 700 years ago. We were the tip of the spear of the U.S. Army. We land in Kandahar with these big ideals of bringing peace and democracy and ensuring American security. And you and I both felt the same frustrations. We felt the same demoralizations. But, my reaction was to bury all of it and then run straight to the private sector and try and figure it out and close this chapter in my life. Yeah. You chose to channel that emotion, that pain, into a really phenomenal book, a narrative that I actually characterize as nothing short of brave, right? And folks who haven't read the book, if you're joining us for the first time, and forgive me for, Erik, if I hope this is a correct characterization, but I believe you call out some fundamental weaknesses in our national security processes and infrastructure that do a disservice to veterans, that do a disservice to our country, and quite frankly, the local nationals in Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria and everywhere we have ground forces. I guess really what I want to ask you is how did you summon the courage to write this book, and what is the driving force here? What are you trying to get us to, as a nation, understand?
Yeah, I felt a couple different things. I writing a book, and this is the book. The book looks like this, called Un-American: A Soldier's Reckoning of Our Longest War. I don't recommend writing a book unless you feel like if you didn't write it, you would be living your life in some way unfulfilled if you didn't finish it before you died. And like, you have to have that level of something sort of like eating away at you, this sort of like righteous fire in your belly that that just keeps burning. Because it, like, for me, this took a long time, not just in terms of writing the actual pages, but getting to the emotional place and be in a spot where I could write about this to the depth that I wanted to. And it surely could be done where you could write a political screed and have some sort of a polemic that's just a loud wail of some sort of, this is making me angry, and we're killing all of these civilians and it's not helping America back home. But to have that, but also marry that up with a lot of research as well. So I'm not just saying, here is a microscopic thing that happened as an anecdote, but what I try to do is zoom in on an individual experience, as traumatic as that thing may be for any one person or group of people, but then use basically literature research and academic research to expand the bubble, to say, I'm not special. Rajiv's experience isn't special. This is happening multiplied by thousands and thousands of incidents across the country. And if you can understand the weight, the quantum of that, you can understand why the Afghan people will fight us for as long as we are in their country occupying it. So, right. I mean, I went on after military service to graduate school at Oxford, and I did an MBA and a Master's of Science studying climate change. And one of the things in that second degree program studying climate change is this sense that when you live in both worlds, where you are starting to get a scientific understanding of how serious one threat is, but then what you hear all the time is, we should be afraid of brown people with that are not showering enough with AK-47s that are going to come hunt you and your family here in the United States. And like the weighting is completely illogical, and it sort of reminds me of like Thinking Fast and Slow by Kahneman, about like what is the real sort of threat and the sort of animal fear versus like the true sense of the word of like what is actually a problem. So I felt sort of uniquely positioned that I had taken several years to think about it after experiencing it and studying it, and then being able to couch it in a much greater sort of understanding of the world, living in the UK and Australia, and having the mercy of distance, and realizing that if we don't change our culture, we're going to continue sending soldiers to wars that are self-perpetuating with no benefit for the United States. We're going to continue killing. We've killed over, the war on terror, that is, has killed over 110 9/11s worth of civilians, and that's unarmed civilians. And we've wasted $6.4 trillion, which could be far better spent, doing things like climate mitigation. So
Right.
that fires you up. That is the calling card, not of just, I want to write a book, but this is a generational struggle that we need to change the culture of America and how our relationship works with the military, because it's just not helpful. And I want to see America succeed and focus on the right priorities, and that is sort of the tongue-in-cheek irony of the book. It's called Un-American because people have called me un-American, specifically even my own family members, for talk about some of these topics. And
So
go ahead. Sorry.
if I may, I'd love to actually dive into some of them
Yeah.
because these are really poignant, and I hope you don't mind, but I've kind of crystallized a few of the ones that stand out to me. The first
Sure.
one, and I think the most interesting one, is the infantilization of the soldier or the service member. We treat them, in your book, you kind of pretty much call it out. We treat young soldiers like idiots,
Yeah.
like kids, like teenagers. And so they almost behave that way.
Well,
But
you also have we call it babysitting, right? Like,
yeah.
they use the verb of babysitting the soldiers is sort of like something tossed around with NCOs and officers of like, you got to babysit these young enlisted soldiers.
And maybe we can help the audience kind of understand when we say infantilization of the soldier. I would argue that what that means in a very like literal sense is everything from like the hyper over structuring of your time and your resources, right? So soldiers typically don't have a lot of freedom to think critically and make mistakes and learn and grow up. Whereas, and by the way, I don't know about you, but when I was serving with soldiers from, let's say, the United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, I felt like a lot of their soldiers were a lot more mature. There was not as much yelling or the hazing. They had a much more gentleman's culture. I felt that, at least in my experience. And I don't know. Is that ringing? Am I describing this infantilization correctly as per your book?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I didn't have a lot of interaction with foreign countries, and how the sort of interrelationships were between the sort of hierarchy of ranks. But I think you've nailed it. I mean, I think one of the disempowering aspects of the military is that there isn't so much an obligation to question things when it doesn't make sense. So you.
Yeah, I agree. And I'd actually like to dive into this
Yeah.
because in that unquestioned compliance to orders in times of chaos, isn't that a good thing? Because how can a military simultaneously demand that sort of instantaneous followership of orders, but still allow space for critical thinking and discourse around the ethics and morality around orders?
So, I mean, I think in the moment, right? No different than if you were a sports team, and maybe this isn't the perfect analogy, but like when it is execution mode, if you're not playing your position, then the team loses, or in this case, worse things happen. People die. So, I mean, there is this element of, in the moment, if you're in the firefight, uh, it's not the time to think, well, we shouldn't have been walking down this path anyway, because that doesn't matter. You're here now.
Hmm.
However, at any different point, the question is usually reserved, and I think that this is sort of part of the education system of West Point as well, is that you in the problem solving process, you want to ask the questions upstream of why are we doing this, and what are we solving for? What is the outcome that we want here from this? You don't focus on those questions very much in the military. It's usually the how. So you don't talk about the why, you talk about the how. Now that we've assigned this job to you, it's not for you to think about too much. But now the thing is for you to, how do we do that as best as possible?
Hmm.
And
You know,
that's an
that's yeah.
execution mindset rather than a strategy mindset. And it's a lot harder once you've picked the wrong strategy, um, to make good on it. If you're in the wrong place doing the wrong thing, no amount of good tactics is going to fix that. You need to do the right things upstream before you get down.
Very fascinating. And I think in its design, because we have a civilian led and managed military, meaning that our elected officials, the Department of Defense, are theoretic, and of course Congress, are theoretically, you know, like they're theoretically taking that sort of upstream decision making away from the military, so that all we should do is execute, right?
Yeah,
And I think
yeah.
that I think that made sense, let's say in a big, uh, superpower versus superpower type conflict back in, maybe 100 years ago. But in today's day and age, when the platoon leader, the squad leader, the patrolman on the ground, like a single bullet can cause such catastrophic events, and actually, these civilian casualties. For every one, I mean, you can rightly call out, General McChrystal calls us out, for every civilian we
Yeah.
kill, we create two more insurgents. Like, it's just, it almost feels like that critical decision making and the what we're doing needs to be pushed down into the ranks of the service. I
Hmm.
imagine that's kind of maybe potentially part of the thesis.
Yeah, I think it's also deeply entwined with how you think of your own service.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I talk about briefly, the military is very good about selling some of the proximate things about the military. They
Mm-hmm.
sell you on teamwork, they sell you on leadership, they sell you on fitness, they sell you on maybe some education opportunities because it's prohibitively expensive to go to university. They don't want to talk about the uncomfortable things, and they don't want you to think about this too much or too deeply, which is sort of the, well, are we there for the right reasons? If you're responsible, for causing harm in another country to civilian people, how are you going to think about it in 15 years? What is that long term, that long tail cost of war? And don't advertise that or talk about that. And that's sort of, it's almost like sort of in medical terminology when you're talking about informed consent. That like in order to have a procedure done on you, the doctor should tell you here are some of the possible outcomes. You could die. Here what amputations look like. This could be you. This is how many soldiers have PTSD. How many receive disability after they finish their term of service. Those things aren't discussed, and we're doing a great disservice to Americans who are brave enough to want to take part in national security.
It had, when you were signing up for the service, had someone made those statistics clear to you,
No,
you wouldn't have signed up.
no, I think, I mean, that's part of the reason I wrote this book as well, is because there wasn't this book in existence. Um, and you could look back on, some books from World War One, for instance, sort of war is hell and whatever else. And, there's plenty in that genre. But at the same time, I think that America is a culture where military service is seen as an absolute good, and it should be, in my opinion, more closely viewed as a relative good based on whatever it is that the service is being used for. And what I mean by that is there's greater risk associated with the decision to serve than there is in just about any other form of public service.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to be a teacher and you become better at teaching, community's probably better off. If you're a firefighter and you're better at fighting fires, the community's probably better off. But if you become better at shooting people in the face and occupying another country, not only are those people not better off in that foreign country, but it doesn't mean that America is better off either. It doesn't mean the taxpayer is better off.
So this actually leads me to the second, like, really interesting takeaway from your book, which was this idea of conscientious objection. So according to American law, conscientious objection, you have the right to do it, but that is against war in general.
It's agnostic.
It's agnostic of the conflict in which you're in. And you had a really interesting anecdote, and I hope you don't mind if I summarize it for our viewers, but you actually told your managers in the military, your captains, your hierarchy, that, hey, this is not working for me. Like, you've seen civilians killed, you were seeing some really just firing.
Also lying. Also, like, the military actively lying about potential war crimes and recategorizing them to cover their own ass.
Understood. Yeah.
And lying about civilian deaths, blaming the civilians rather than the military that was responsible for killing them. And you see that enough times, and then you object.
Thank you for that. Yeah, and you were standing up for standing up to this, and you were asking for the opportunity to transfer. And you make the case that, we need to make it relative to the conflict. But I guess here's the problem that I had with that, just as a platoonian myself. If I decide that the war is not just, but not, or rather, if I decide that the war is just, but not just enough, meaning not valuable enough for me to leave my wife and kids, and I just voluntarily decide to object to this conflict, aren't we creating kind of unfair standards? If, like, let's say we're a platoon and we all go and train and get ready for war, and then when it's time to deploy, like a spattering of some of the soldiers decide, nah, it's not worth it for me, and the other ones are, actually, I have to go because I need the combat pay, I need the hazard pay. Aren't we kind of creating like a standard of privilege for, like, us quote unquote elites get to just say, like, hey, I'm an officer, I'm gonna go chill out here and take the GMAT and get ready to go to business school, while these soldiers who don't have options are gonna go to war? Do you feel like conscientious objection to individual conflicts could create that discrepancy?
I mean, I don't know what the best way would be, and I'm sure that there's many different ways by which you could actually enact such a policy. But I mean, like, rephrasing it in a slightly different way, how many people would object to fighting the war if the war was actually about American national security? If it was actually about defending the domestic borders of the United States? Tell me, like, Rajiv, how many times has America been attacked by a foreign force?
Honestly, I don't know at the top of my head the whole number, but the counter argument would be,
it's the War of 1812, an asterisk with Pearl Harbor, because it wasn't even a state at the time. It was, we occupied it from the native Hawaiians, and it was a military outpost. And September 11th.
Yeah,
those are the three times that, like, a large scale attack has taken place on American soil. Everything else is America playing offense, and it's very difficult to call it the Department of Defense when it's really the Department of Offense, and it is us committing acts of political violence as a country in somebody else's country, where they must deal with the far larger costs of hosting it, the civilians, their industry being disrupted, not ours. So I think that, and that's really my point, is that if I went back home to Boston and Boston was being attacked and occupied in the same fashion as what we as Americans do in other countries, I too would join the insurgency, so to speak, to fight back against these people that constantly aim guns in my faces, have drones fly over, tap my phone, take, people that are trying to have their own country to themselves to black sites to be tortured, and having that as a systematic policy of how they use foreign policy. I would look at them and probably think they're pretty evil, whoever this person is that's occupying Boston, and I would fight back. So it makes it such that frivolous wars would be harder to recruit for. It would be difficult to raise an army when you know that they can elect out once they realize what it's about. So it would be very difficult to send the army off to war when no one wants to fight it.
This is super fascinating. And I'll tell you why, because when I hear your argument, and I've heard this argument so many times when I hear it, it's accompanied by, you know what, this is why we need a draft so that everyone shares in the conflict. If you think about it, the isolated conscientious objection to a single conflict is the antithesis of a draft, where it's not that the whole burden is shared across everybody. You're saying that not only can we're not going to draft you, we're going to, even those in the service, we're going to let you self-select out. And it's actually turning it on its head, because rather than saying, yeah, everybody needs to feel the pain of the government's decision to go to war, so we have a draft, what you're saying is, hey, we need to make it hyper optional so that the government has the burden of proof for why this is in American national security interest. I think it's a very interesting argument.
I mean, I like the notion as well of skin in the game, and I've had conversations with other people about sort of the draft. I mean, another large component is having taxes linked to war, which used to be the case in America. So, the GWAT is the first time in American history where America has gone to war, and then there's tax cuts for the rich. In every other conflict, when America goes to war and we have to pay for it, the government asks American taxpayers to foot the bill. This is the first time where that hasn't happened. And when there's no sort of blinking red light, it just becomes an accumulation of debt, which then gets passed to future generations of Americans to deal with in some way.
Super interesting, man. And if you don't mind, I'd like to just we have some really great questions coming in from the chat, and I would love to hear it. Actually, I think this is a great question from Shankar Venkatraman. Did either of us read books on Afghanistan, like Charlie Wilson's War, before you left on your deployment? Erik, what did you read before you left on your deployment?
I mean, I think I've read most of the literary canon of what sort of West Point shared with you, and then probably a little bit more. I'm thinking like there was, good old Tactics of the Crescent Moon and Taliban, and like all the sort of stuff that you read to try to get prepared for whatever this deployment was. The Unforgiving Minute by Mullaney. What were some of the others? I'm trying to think. I also, some of the sort of like war porn type stuff. I've read Lone Survivor and stuff like that. And it's fetish soldier war porn in many ways. So I mean, like I dabbled in those different things. I think sort of what changed my mind was reading more broadly. Starting to read Noam Chomsky, for instance, and Howard Zinn. And starting to and that sort of other group of academics and looking at American foreign policy in a different perspective. And the real turning point as well for me is leaving America and actually going to the UK for 2 years and living in Australia for 5 years and seeing how their culture treats their military, how they think about military service, what they think about political violence and when a country should be involved in it, whether they think about actually investigating war crimes, as opposed to the United States, which shoves it under the rug and threatens the International Criminal Court when they say we believe that U.S. soldiers are responsible for war crimes. And just seeing culturally these differences and this sort of the thank you for your service post 9/11 stuff that's not helping soldiers. It's unclear who it's really helping. It seems like it's really just the person that's doing the thanking is patting themselves on the back, as if it's sort of, I'm letting you know that I'm a conscious citizen. But what I don't think about is why you're going to war. So I'm going to pat you on the back while you go to your 4th year long deployment to something I would never serve in, of course. And none of my friends would serve in. And I think it's actually, outside of this discussion of thank you for your service, I think the war is really stupid. But I'll keep telling you, and you'll go off and spend that year away from your family. And we keep doing that as a culture. That is what being patriotic in America is. And I think it's time to flip that on its head.
It's unbelievable, right? And I get it. And I was there, and I'm actually just like, this is the kind of bravery I'm talking about, man. Like, just to come out and say it. I think part of my hesitation, just having serving those same places that we did, was I just realized that at some point I'm gonna have to unpack all these really unpleasant memories. I mean, let me ask you this: like, I was in Afghanistan when General Stanley McChrystal mandated that all ordnance must be ordered by a flag officer due to the outrageous civilian casualties we were causing. And they also said it couldn't be dropped within 100 meters of a compound. So what I found was that, like, the enemies were just shooting at us from compounds because they would just understand and reverse engineer our rules of engagement and then find other ways to put Americans in danger. So let's talk about these war crimes, because you and I both had talked about this earlier, right? Like, civilian casualties is something that are just astronomical in these times, but we kind of, like you said, we push it under the rug. So, I mean, how, I guess, should we ask our leaders to value the lives of local nationals in these countries we're serving? So let's just assume, for the sake of argument, that we should be there. Like, Osama bin Laden's still alive. He attacked the United States. We're in Afghanistan looking for him.
Even though none of the 19 hijackers were from Afghanistan or Iraq, but let's just assume that the facts don't matter and that we're there. Yeah. Okay, go on. This is good. I like this.
I'm just trying to isolate like one piece of incompetence at a time to kind of see like where we should be. But, like, let's say we're in Afghanistan, we have a fictionalized reason for being there.
You mean like the real one, which is a fiction? That one.
Exactly. How are we supposed to ask our military leaders and our political officers to value the lives of local nationals in the countries we're serving?
I mean, I think the ideal is a 1-to-1 exchange rate with the people that you are closest with. And I think that that's also an unreasonable and unnatural ask. And I'll give you sort of the analogy of, if somebody held a gun to your head and said, okay, or maybe rephrase it, held a gun to one of your closest family members' heads and said, somebody's going to go. It's either this person or this random person from another country. Who's it going to be? The decision might be quite clear, and that you're going to axe the foreigner who you don't know, who doesn't look like you, who speaks a different language, and you've devalued their life in some way. And I think that, in a certain extent, to take this out several ripples or layers, right? Like, it's natural to feel emotionally closer, to have bonds with those that are more proximate to you, your family, your tight friends, the groups that you share some sort of identity with. And maybe this is Sebastian Junger's sort of tribe book, to throw in a parallel to the other book in the club. But imagine you keep extending that. What are the features then? And you say, well, then maybe it's the people in my city, and the people in my political party or in my country. But then, the question is, why would you devalue anybody's life anywhere else? And I don't think that there's a really strong reason for it, obviously. Like, at the end of your life, when you hold up the proverbial mirror and judge yourself on the actions you've taken, how are we in the military going to think about the way that the U.S. military treated our Afghan brothers and sisters? How are we
Yeah.
going to feel about that? And the answer is not good. And you know, if and I'll give you a couple analogies. If you walk down the street and you turn a corner on a city block and you knock somebody over, what you're going to do is apologize and help that person up. And if there were, or if it was worse, a car accident, pay for damages, and there's lots of ways to do it. Well, what does the U.S. military do?
Mhm.
Well, when you kill civilians, maybe we call an air medevac for them, and I've done this. I've called air medevacs for civilians injured by U.S. forces, including my own platoon,
Mhm.
and they'll get treated. There's no sort of payments at all for, there is a payment system, but it's wildly dysfunctional and doesn't work and doesn't value their life at all in any sort of meaningful way. And, we talk a lot about, U.S. soldiers who suffer from PTSD or that have an amputated limb, and they receive the best of care at Walter Reed, and they're given, like one of my friends who has uh, basically a prosthetic made in Iceland, made out of carbon fiber. Ain't nobody coming for the Afghans to help them uh, with their injuries, their lifetime injuries. Ain't no Walter Reed out in Afghanistan helping the people of Afghanistan deal with the injuries that they don't deserve to have at the hands of forces that occupy their country. And they have the right to not be in fear from U.S. soldiers.
Mhm.
They have that right. They should, and we should treat them that way. And I think that when we get to that point, how should generals think about it? I mean, you basically have to have something very close to a zero tolerance of any civilian casualties, and that's whether we're talking about morally or strategically, to use the McChrystal math analogy, where for every innocent civilian killed, the McChrystal math says you are thereby creating sort of 10 insurgents that are now angry at you and will either actively shoot at you and try to kill you, or at maybe a level further removed, support the insurgents by cooking for them, giving them a place to sleep. That you're changing how permissive the environment is for every civilian death. And if they know, and they do, that we as a country do not respect them or their lives, then how could we ever possibly hope for some sort of mutual respect between our two countries to have a true partnership? Because if you don't respect the other people because we kill them without much thought, and we don't change tactics, and any civilian death is too much, but we're not going to actually do anything about it, well, then it sends them a very crystal clear message that America is not their friend. America does not respect them, and that we are using them as a political tool, and asking them to bow down in supplication towards whatever America wants. And if America wants their government to look a certain way or have certain policies, that's what they must do.
So, Matt Gertzenzang, I appreciate your question here in the chat. Do you think it's actually a devaluation of human life or a decoupling of consequences from those actions? And, Matt, your question actually really speaks to me, because, so Erik, I guess what I'm trying to say here is, like, when I was in Afghanistan and I would, let's say we're on patrol, we get attacked, and we call for ordnance, we call for aircraft attacks, we call for mortar fire, whatever. Like, I am nowhere near that target. Like, I can't see it, I can't
Yeah,
feel it.
yeah,
And I think what he's calling out here, and I think this is kind of my cognitive dissonance, is that, when you're in the firefight as a soldier, and you just know you're getting attacked,
yeah.
right? All the math and all the discussion of logic, why we're there, what's the
Goes out the
goal,
window.
it goes out the window, right? I'm trying to
Yeah,
survive. I'm trying to keep
yep,
everybody alive. And
yep,
so I just unleash hell on I bring the force of the United States government down on whoever's bringing this pain on
yeah,
my unit. And I
yeah,
feel I have no problem, no shame. And I stand
yeah,
by that
yeah,
very strongly. And then, you know, we go back into the cop, and then let's say a couple hours later, that's when all the civilian casualties start rolling in,
Yeah.
you know, asking for medical treatment and everything like that. And of course, I'm not a medic. I'm not actually treating them. I may see
Yeah.
them, our, you know, our outposts in La Coquelle and Housi Medad. These were really small outposts in the middle of nowhere in Kandahar. But there's this almost, I think at the time, the rush of adrenaline creates this like cognitive dissonance between the violence we brought to that area and the casualties that rolled into the gate. I think psychologically I didn't put the two and two together, right?
Yeah.
And I think that
Totally.
gap, I think as I get older, that gap is going away. Like I'm a
Yeah.
little wiser, I'm a little smarter, I have time to reflect and let it sink in. And now, like,
Yeah.
you know, the pain and suffering that I saw, I'm actually like drawing the line between you know, some of those targets I was trying to hit. And so, I mean, yeah, dude, I don't even know. Like, it's like by the time I'm hitting the ground in Afghanistan, the opportunity to value or devalue a human life is already
Yeah.
gone,
It's
right?
already gone.
Because it's already gone.
Yeah.
It's too late.
And
Shit,
I
man.
mean, it's well, a couple things on that. I mean, there's sort of I describe in the book sort of this slippery slope uh, mentality where, and I think that this is probably fairly similar to what I've read, you know, about books on Vietnam. But sort of this notion that every sort of Taliban fighter that's trying to kill you, or every sort of terrorist, is evil, right? And it's just a logical tree, and every terrorist, or you know, America hating, innocent civilian killing person is 100% evil. And then the next step is sort of this belief that, well, if a large component of the civilian populace is supporting those people, then they are sort of the enemy. And they are then also sort of evil because they are providing food and aid and calling them, or not telling us that there's an IED down this road and they know it, and my guys are going to walk on it and have both their legs blown off. And they know it. And you start to get this ire and hatred, and you can see how that, you know, if there was any chance of loving and respecting a group of people, over time that can be eaten away with that sort of slippery slope um, approach. And I mean, the other thing I was going to mention was that when what was the last question? You're talking about the devaluation of human life, right?
Yeah, yeah, and because it's decoupled from, you know,
Yeah,
our actions. You know, the consequences
it's
of our actions are decoupled. Yeah.
it's I mean, war is that special breed of insanity where the thing that you do, like calling in that airstrike, is both the logical decision and also simultaneously and paradoxically morally repugnant.
Yeah.
And it is
Well,
both of those things that have to live in your mind and in your soul for the rest of your life, that it was the right thing to do because I am being shot at and I care more about getting this injured guy who, in the golden hour, if he doesn't get to the next level of care, is going to die. And I just want to, in a very animal sense, stop getting shot at. So you call in airstrike on the target that you believe is best shooting at you, um, to evac, and it's also the same morally repugnant decision because it's something that no one would support.
yeah.
And you know, deep in your bones, if you grew up on the other side, if Rajiv or Erik grew up in Afghanistan, in the same way I use the Massachusetts analogy, I would fight me too.
Yeah, absolutely, man. We got a couple more questions coming in. I think Shankar has another great one. If let's say if excuse me, if Trump as an average citizen made an argument, people who go to battle are suckers. Um, how does that strike you? You know, are they being quote unquote suckered into battle because they are poor, underprivileged? Are they actually quote unquote suckers? I mean, I guess Did Trump actually let a little truth slip out here? Is the
Uh,
question.
no. I mean, well, it's complicated, but I mean, I think that a desire to serve one's country and to provide protection, and hopefully, as humanity continues to get away from violence as a tool, like it's not a tool, um, it's political violence, and it's criminal. But as long as there is a risk that you're going to be harmed in your own space, providing national security should be admirable. But the problem is that our military is used in ways that has nothing to do with national security and nothing to do with the protecting the national borders of the country. And I think that rather than saying that they are suckers, because that's not true, I think that there's also an element of um, two things: excusable ignorance about what the military does and what we go off to. If I knew everything that I know now, and I went back to 2003, Erik, I wouldn't have applied to West Point. I would have done something else. But I didn't know that. And that's excusable ignorance. And then there's also just irresponsibility on behalf of folks in Congress that have basically abdicated their war function, where we have not declared war on any of these countries. It just sort of bleeds on forever and ever. So I think, if anything, it is betrayal more than it is being a sucker. It is individuals who have a desire to serve. They also may be disenfranchised, and those who are most likely to enlist in the military are often those who are in precarious financial positions and everything else. And for whatever reason they join, to misuse their service, to make in that word, to make suckers of them, is a betrayal of their service and of the nation.
Boom! To make suckers of their decision to join and of their service. I love the way you articulated that. One more question that I want to bring in. Well, one thing I watched right after I read your book, and I hope you don't mind me. I hope this doesn't embarrass you, but I actually
No,
watched
no.
some of the testimony of John Kerry in
Yeah.
front of Congress, because I see so many similarities between your actions since coming back, right? Like, he also saw an unjust war. Most soldiers that were coming out back from from Vietnam were not like nowhere near as active as and thoughtful and articulate as Kerry was, and he took an institutional stand,
Yeah.
and and you did something very similar, and it didn't also miss me that you're both from Massachusetts.
Yeah.
Uh, I'm just curious, man. Like, you've got this amazing passion, this wonderful heart. You've got this articulate voice that you speak for guys like me who just either feel the same things but just don't know what to say. We don't have platforms, whatever. Um, like, what do you do next, man? What's in it for you in your career?
It's a good question, man. It's not what I'm doing now, which I'm currently I've been a management consultant for several years, and I took this time out to write. And that being said, like, I don't think I would have been able to write this book as I did if I actually didn't spend time in management consulting. And I say that because I make analogies with math and stuff like that to punch people in the face with how stupid things are. And like, I probably wouldn't have thought about it that way had I not had that other experience, or to talk perhaps as deftly about the economics of war and $400 fully burdened price gasoline at the point of use, and like that sort of like research and depth, and like that wouldn't happen. So I'm glad, like, I've learned some of those tools, but it is not my future. The two things that I'm thinking about, and I'm very serious about both of them, which I alluded to very briefly in the previous call with you, is trying to find a route to market for adapting a book this book or something similar to it for TV, and basically creating a limited series for Netflix. And I'm talking with a director and a producer at the moment. The director's currently working on a different Netflix thing, actually a true crime show. So when he is done, the plan is to put the three of us in some sort of a beach house somewhere for 60 days and sit there and just crank this thing out together as a group, and then try to sell it. And the reason I'm doing that, and there's a reason for it, is that the people who need to hear this dialogue on 99 pages, the people that need to read this book and have that discussion, are the ones who are least likely to buy it. So you need to reach people where they are and make it mass consumption friendly. Not everyone wants to read 300 pages, but they will watch 10 1-hour shows on Netflix if the series grabs them by the scruff of their neck. So I'm trying to do that in that medium. And the other thing is, I am very seriously considering politics in the future. I'm worried, worried for my country, worried for the state of the planet, and that our generation and the previous generations have made is going to pass down a legacy of a denuded, mass extinction world in terms of biodiversity loss and climate change. And there's a really, really, really small window, and I know this from studying it. And America doesn't have it together. One of the things that's extremely important to know, and to go on my very brief soapbox about climate change, is that whenever people say, "Oh, America's not the worst polluter in the world," that's on the metrics of per annum emissions. They're second worst in the world in total number. In terms of per capita, again, we're extremely bad. And the measure that matters is the cumulative emissions since the Industrial Revolution, because cumulative emissions is the most important one, because when you emit a ton of carbon in the air, it stays there for thousands of years. Methane is a different story. So it's still warming. So America has the greatest moral burden and also the greatest amount of resources to do something about this problem. And the last generation, including up through now, has basically thrown science into reverse, and we're like running away from facts. And it makes me sad, and it should make everyone terrified about the future if they don't kick some people out of politics. And I would be happy to start firing at least one person one at a time, and hopefully get enough of a bullhorn to encourage other people to fire the rest of them and move forward.
Well, I tell you what, when you said that, you had a lot of support coming in through the chat. Judy Bello, I think you got a lot of fans here, so we'll have you back on both for your TV show and for your first run. I think that, man, I think I'm personally very taken by your bravery and your honesty and your sincerity, and just the way you are so able to articulate. It's great. You bring an articulate voice, but you make the problem sound so simple, right? I mean, and you make it very achievable for someone to understand what we saw over there, right? And I've struggled to make sense of it. In fact, and I'm glad that your management consultant training gave you the tools to draw the correct analogies and make the coherent arguments, because I chose to kind of just close that chapter and walk away. And, I'm just very proud of you, Erik, for doing what you're doing. And I think this entire crew here, we've had quite a few people chime in. We're all very supportive of you. I want to just kind of give you the final words here. And I guess what I'd love to hear from you in our last minutes before we close out here is for our listeners who may want to get more involved and actually try and help some of these issues, particularly with veterans. What are some calls to action for us, right? Like whether it's a charity or organization that you think is doing good work, or something, a message that we can send to our elected officials. If you could, offer just a few call to actions. Buy your book. Obviously, everybody's going to buy Erik's book. But beyond that, like anything specific that you'd like our audience to kind of follow through on.
It's a good question, and I don't think I truthfully have the best answer for it either. I don't think that, giving, and people can choose to spend their money. And I'm not hating on Wounded Warriors Project, for instance, but giving money to a charity in a country that already does a lot for American veterans who are injured during a war of aggression on some other country, where in an order of magnitude they have suffered so much more at the hands of the war that we've created in their country, that we're not winning the suffering Olympics as Americans over here. And the people who are really hurting, beyond the soldiers, and not to discount that there's pain, because there is, and I understand it, is the far larger number in the countries that we're occupying. So, I mean, to me, I think that the most patriotic thing that you can do is to speak out, and very loudly, whenever you believe that American military servicemen are having their service misused. And the best ways to do that, is actively start questioning and defeating and deconstructing this George W. Bush era post 9/11 jingoism of, the U.S. military can do no wrong, and the only solution to defense is throw more money at it. So what I would very practically ask, I mean, of course, again, buy the book and give it a read, but I mean, start demanding of your local politicians, your local congressmen, to stop spending money on war, to start grabbing a hold of their responsibility to declare war, rather than just letting it happen for years and years. And with those hits, we'll slowly get there, and it's not going to be all at once. No single vote is going to change American culture. It's going to be a slow process, and rather than the long arc of justice that people sometimes speak of, where in a Steven Pinker, The Better Angels of Our Nature sense, where if you zoom out far enough, that the human condition is actually quite positive, that we're not, torturing people nearly as much as they did in the Middle Ages, and murder rates are lower than they were in the Middle Ages. That's great. The long arc is going. Let's just make it a bit shorter and faster.
Well said, man. What a brilliant way to end the session. To all who tuned in, I am just so grateful. This month of veterans discussions in November has really caused me to think a lot differently, even just the discussions, the comments, the questions you're asking. I just want to say thank you to everyone who bravely asked and responded to questions over the past couple of weeks. So we're not done for Veterans Month. Have a happy, wonderful Thanksgiving. But on Sunday, we are going to be on. We're going to be having a conversation with author Jack Weatherford. Get this, he is the world's leading scholar on Genghis Khan. You want to talk about a veteran success story? We're talking about someone who grew up in the steppes of Mongolia, just a tribal son, and he grows to lead the largest bureaucracy the world has ever known. It is a stretch, I get it, to compare Genghis Khan and his life story to the plight of veterans, but there are more similarities than you think. So I'd ask you to tune in next Sunday. We're going to talk to Jack Weatherford about Genghis Khan. But for now, Erik, I want to say thank you so much for this book. Just me personally, it was a journey, and I'm just so proud of you, man. Keep doing what you're doing. I think there's a lot of veterans that are looking at you, and just very grateful that you're stepping up and speaking on behalf of what we saw.
Thanks, brother. I appreciate it.
All right, team. Take care. Have a great Thanksgiving. I'm grateful for